There was a winter evening in the early 20th century when a celebrated physician, admired in public, unraveling in private, closed the door to his study and did something he would never explain to his colleagues. He did not pray. He did not meditate in the modern sense. He did not reach for a textbook. He opened a leather-bound journal, one he kept like contraband, and drew the same image again and again, a serpent biting its own tail, not as decoration, not as mythology, as a diagram. And beneath it, he wrote a sentence that reads less like psychology and more like a warning: the crown is not found. It is remembered. If you are listening to this, it is unlikely you are here by accident, not because an algorithm has magical powers, not because fate is trying to entertain you, but because a certain kind of person recognizes a certain kind of language. You have felt it before, when a symbol hits you before you can explain it. When a story feels like it is describing you, even if it is set centuries away. When you realize your life is not just events, but a pattern, almost a ritual, repeating until something in you finally changes. Tonight, we are going to talk about the ring-serpent, why ancient alchemists treated it like a living key, why initiatory traditions guarded it behind oaths, and why one modern thinker, at the edge of psychological collapse, recognized in it the hidden architecture of liberation. Not the liberation sold in self-help books, not the optimize your productivity kind, the older liberation, the kind that breaks a paradigm so thoroughly you can never again be controlled by the same illusions. By the end of this documentary, you will understand what the Ring-Serpent Crown means, why it describes the real mechanics of inner transformation, why the descent is not a mistake, but a method how to apply this in ordinary life, without fantasy and without being swallowed by it. This is not motivational content. This is recognition, and it starts where most people refuse to look. The early 20th century was not merely an era of new machines, it was an era of new pressure. Factories multiplied. Cities swelled. Traditional religion weakened. War revealed what industrial intelligence could do to human flesh, and behind all of it, something quieter, but just as violent, was happening. The inner world was destabilizing. When the outer world changes faster than the psyche can adapt, the mind does what it always does. It compensates. It invents masks. It clings to certainty. And when those strategies fail, it collapses into anxiety, obsession, numbness, rage, or despair. This is the environment in which our physician, let us call him Dr. Cassian Vale, began to suspect something heretical. The modern mind was not becoming more evolved, it was becoming more dissociated. He watched people who were competent by day become strangers to themselves at night. He listened to dreams that spoke in images older than the dreamer's biography, and he tracked repeating symbols across patients who had never met: serpents, crowns, labyrinths, flooded cities, black suns, divine children. The implication was unsettling. If these symbols were not learned, then something in the human being was not personal. Something deeper was speaking. A hidden layer, a reservoir of patterns that did not belong to one life, but to life itself. Then something happened that forced Dr. Vale to stop treating these symbols as academic curiosities. He began to experience them, not as ideas, as encounters. There are moments when the familiar identity, career, relationships, self-image no longer holds. You can feel it. The mask slips in conversation, old ambitions go flat. The nervous system acts threatened when nothing is wrong. Dreams become vivid, relentless. Sometimes terrifying coincidences cluster like someone is rearranging the stage around you. Dr. Vale called this period his inner siege. He began a practice most people would call dangerous. He entered the imagination deliberately, not to escape reality, but to confront what lived beneath it. He wrote dialogues with figures that rose on their own. Wise strangers, hostile presences, seductive guides, childlike messengers, and shadowy doubles carrying everything he refused to admit. He recorded it in a private volume we will call the Vermilion Ledger, written in the ink of crisis, the heat of a psyche being reorganized. This is where the ring-serpent returned. Not as folklore, as instruction. A creature that consumes itself is not simply destroying itself. It is feeding itself, death and nourishment in one motion. And that paradox, destroyer and sustainer ending and beginning, became the central clue of Dr. Vale's system. You do not break free by ascending away from your darkness. You break free by integrating it into a larger wholeness. That is what the Ring-Serpent Crown signifies. Not purity, sovereignty. Most people hear crown and imagine domination. In real initiatory systems, a crown is the opposite, an emblem of service to a higher order. It is earned by submitting the small self, the everyday ego, to a deeper center. Dr. Vale drew a distinction that changes everything. The ego is the center of conscious identity, choosing, planning, defending, narrating. The deeper center, call it the core, the axis, the inner sovereign, is the total psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal, instinct and spirit. Modern culture treats the ego as king, but the ego is not built to rule the whole inner kingdom. It is built to navigate the surface. When the ego tries to govern everything, control emotion, suppress instinct, deny grief, avoid contradiction, it creates a fragile tyranny, and then life breaks it, not to punish you, to correct the hierarchy. The Ring-Serpent Crown is the image of corrected hierarchy. A circle that contains opposites without annihilating them, a boundary that is not a prison but a vessel. This is where occultism becomes relevant, not as aesthetic, but as technology. The oldest esoteric systems were never merely about planets and potions. They were about inner operations. Read alchemical manuscripts literally, and they sound absurd. Furnaces, metals, royal marriages, kings dissolved in acids, creatures cooked and resurrected. But Dr. Vale noticed the same motifs in dreams, not metaphorically, but structurally. In transformation, people dream of descending into caves or basements encountering rot, sludge, black water witnessing hostile forces forced into contact, finding a stone, a child, a luminous center returning with a new orientation to life. The great work began to look less like primitive chemistry and more like a coded manual for psychological metamorphosis. At the center of that manual was a principle found across traditions, the union of opposites, not eliminating one side, not choosing the light as spiritual bypassing, but holding tension long enough for a third thing to be born. The ring-serpent is the boundary that makes that possible. It forms the circle within which transformation can happen without the psyche spilling into chaos. And yes, there is risk approach the unconscious directly, and you approach a force that does not speak in polite sentences. It speaks in myth, image, sensation, and compulsion. Dr. Vale warned the work can lead to inflation, ego identifying with archetypal power possession, being driven by unconscious energy you mistake for truth, destabilization, especially without grounding. This is why authentic traditions built containers, ritual structure, ethical discipline, mentorship, and symbolic frameworks that prevent the seeker from drowning in raw psyche. Modern people often attempt the descent alone and call the consequences awakening. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is fragmentation. The difference is the witness. Here is the mechanism Dr. Vale believed was hidden in plain sight. To transform, the ego must surrender its primacy, but consciousness must remain present enough to witness the process. If you surrender without witnessing, you drown. If you witness without surrendering, you stagnate. The ring-serpent teaches this double movement. It devours itself. Surrender, it remains a circle. Witness, that is why it appears as a crown, because the one who can hold surrender and witness at the same time becomes internally sovereign, not controlling life, but no longer controlled by unconsciousness. 1. The cracking of the mask. The first confrontation is with the persona. The role, the performance, the social identity that helped you function. It often arrives as illogical, burnout, sudden disgust with a life you once pursued, a crisis, exposing how much of you was performance, dreams of costumes, stages, being watched, being unmasked. The mind panics because the mask was safety. But the mask is not the self. 2. The meeting with the shadow double. Once the mask cracks, what rises is what you buried. Destructive impulses. Yes, but also denied vitality. The shadow includes aggression you were trained to deny, desire you learned to judge, envy, hunger, resentment, and also courage, creativity, intensity, qualities you rejected to remain acceptable. It shows up through projection first. People you can stand, or people you obsess over. Often that intensity is your disowned energy knocking from the outside. The work is neither self-hatred nor indulgence. It is ownership. This lives in me. Then a second question: how will I relate to it consciously? 3. The inner counterpart. As shadow work deepens, many encounter an inner, other, a mediator between conscious identity and deeper psyche. Dr. Vale called it the mirror companion. A guide who challenges you, a lover who destabilizes you, a judge who attacks you, a stranger, offering a key you do not yet understand in daily life. It appears through patterns of attraction and repulsion, who you chase, who you fear, who you idealize. Turning relationships into spiritual addiction by confusing the inner figure with an external person. The task is to build a conscious relationship with this inner force, so it becomes a bridge, not a hijacker. 4. The symbols of wholeness. If the work continues, the psyche begins producing symbols of totality: circles, squares, fourfold structures, centered rooms, radiant stones, crowned figures, serpents, forming boundaries. These are not trophies. They are announcements. The psyche is reorganizing around a deeper center. And then comes the hardest ordeal. At a certain point, the psyche stops offering simple solutions and presents contradictions you cannot fix: intimacy and solitude, duty and desire, stability and the urge to burn the old life down. Most people collapse into one side: repression, ideology, moral superiority, spiritual bypassing, cynicism. But Dr. Vale insisted the great work requires something rarer: hold the tension without premature closure. This is not indecision, it is containment, allowing opposites to remain alive in consciousness until a new synthesis forms, often not as an idea, but as a changed way of being. The ring serpent is the emblem of this containment, the vessel where opposites meet without destroying the psyche. And then, inevitably, the threshold arrives, the phase that cannot be romanticized. There is a moment in serious inner work when old psychic structures begin to fail. You feel it as intensified, sometimes nightmarish dreams, coincidences that feel too precise, emotional volatility, identity confusion, grief with no obvious source, a thinning boundary between inner and outer. In clinical language, this resembles breakdown. In initiatory language, it resembles death. Dr. Vale distinguished two paths, collapse into identification, becoming the archetype, the savior, the victim, the chosen one. This is inflation, and it ruins lives. Maintain the witness, experiencing forces moving through you without claiming them as personal greatness or personal doom. This narrow path is why ethics matters. When ego loosens, instinct surges, aggression, lust, transgression fantasies, revenge fantasies, old shame, old grief. The task is not to become good. The task is to become responsible, consciously accountable rather than obedient to borrowed morality. If the person crosses without fleeing or inflating, something changes, not perfection. Wait. When the work stabilizes, three changes often appear. One, less projection. You stop turning people into screens for your disowned psyche. Relationships become clearer, less haunted, less compulsive. Two, symbolic perception. You recognize patterns as patterns, not superstition. Depth, loss becomes initiation. Conflict becomes a clash of forces seeking integration. Recurring dreams become messages from a layer of you that speaks in images. 3, inner authority. You develop an internal reference point that does not collapse under public opinion, family conditioning, or ideological contagion. This does not make you arrogant. It makes you harder to recruit into mass possession. Dr. Vale believed cultures decay when individuals remain unconscious. Because unconscious people are driven by symbols they do not recognize. They follow the loudest archetype wearing a human face. Surrender moral responsibility to a movement and call it virtue. The antidote is not merely better politics. And now the practical question: how do you begin without fantasy and without danger? This is not a ritual to impress unseen forces. It is a method for building the one thing the work requires, a container. Do this once nightly for 7 days. Sit somewhere quiet. No music. No performance. Place a hand on your chest. Breathe slowly. 4 seconds in. Now imagine a circle forming, not as a shield against enemies, but as a boundary of attention. A vow to stay present. Say aloud or silently, I do not flee what I feel. I do not worship what arises. I witness, I integrate. Ask one question only: what part of me have I been paying for by pretending it doesn't exist? Then stop. Do not force an answer. Over the next day, watch. What irritates you disproportionately, what you crave, what you judge, what you idealize, what you avoid. That is your entry point. That is where the ring-serpent is already moving, devouring and regenerating. Whether you call it occultism or psychology, the difference is whether you are conscious of it. The greatest trick of the modern paradigm is not that it tells you lies. It is that it convinces you the only real things are what you can measure, while your life is shaped by forces you refuse to name: shadow, projection, archetypal pattern, unconscious ritual, inherited myth. The Ring-Serpent Crown survives every attempt to bury it because it describes something structural. Transformation is not a straight line. It is a circle that closes, breaks, reforms, and closes again, each time deeper, until you are less possessed by what you do not know, not happier in a simplistic way, more whole, more responsible, more sovereign. Write one sentence for yourself after this: where do I give away my crown? Not to governments, conspiracies, or demons, to your own unconscious patterns. That is the real prison, and that is the real escape. Because the crown is not found, it is remembered.